with the 2MK team. We've been training on mindsets for last week and the start of this one, and today will be no different. This is a US East Coast lobby. Loser stays on. The ID and password should be in our stream title and in our tweet at 2_MK_FGC. So, join us to do your Guilty Gear practice or to get experience with any of the characters that you see. This week the team specifically are dealing with their generally bad offense. So you're going to see me playing a lot more this time. Because breaking my defense is usually something they have more trouble with. Part of the reason for this is because of the way that the team members currently work on getting the opponent to make mistakes that they can be opened up for. Or rather, that they don't do that in itself at all. It's generally easier in this game, for a lot of players especially, to move to where the opponent is likely to want to attack them and wait for that attack. But this means that if you don't actually take the action to make them want to attack a particular way, you don't have any control over whether or not they do. Any opponent who over time learns that you're doing that will either just not attack at all, or move out of the way at the correct time. At best, you'd get this sort of situation, where you've managed to defend against them at the last moment, but without actually landing any attacks or conditioning of your own. Meanwhile, your opponent gets to watch everything you do that has the intention of baiting them into moving, and learn over time which of those things is real and which isn't. They'll take a little damage like that, for example, but they won't care so much because no one really has any reason to. They learn your timing, they learn your spacing, and they learn how and when to counterattack. You in turn end up stuck because you're mostly just trying to figure out how to make them do the incorrect first attack. However, Guilty Gear has a lot more options for the player doing things from that position. Especially as they get more and more meter off of either hitting buttons or moving out of the way correctly.
料理の世界にゴールという言葉はないよ。それは何かの始まりね。いいえ、捕ま
So let's look at a match where this problem has already been solved for both players. They both have enough approach vectors that can also open the opponent up in their specific matchup, that it makes more sense to just go for it. Both characters having decently long ranges and moves that, in turn, barely beat the opponent's range. They're just like this escalating scale between Ino and Kai, which is a lot closer to standard fighting game fare. They each have increasingly slower or longer startup attacks with increasingly greater range. And neither character is particularly great at getting the opponent off them from close without using something that could endanger them. It further helps that Omni-Rabbit knows Rune Siren generally won't block or defend for very long at a time, and not on makeup. And that Rune Siren knows that after a while, she can make an approach that Omni-Rabbit can't necessarily do anything about on reaction easily currently. So both players have become fairly comfortable with the way the other plays. But unfortunately, it teaches neither one how to actually attack when faced with an opponent who has many options of different vectors at one specific range and won't try to do anything much at other ranges. Axel, Jam, to some extent Leo, once he's in a particular stance. Venom, May, sort of, and so on. At that point, you're often hoping that you overwhelm the other player's defense, or that they can't put up enough offense to stop you. But how they choose to approach this problem can be really different between players, leading you to have problems of your own. Because eventually, even without them specifically trying to, you will end up being put out of position. As the Jam player in this matchup, these interactions are not bothering me, because they are either Ino defending against me, or Ino quote-unquote guessing right on a mid-screen interaction that I could probably have just not had. See, once again, this happens because I attack and Ino reacts to my attacking. Once I've attacked and been taken down, different things happen, but they're all based on the same principle. The other lockdown aspect of it could be defeated much more easily if I wasn't so used to the opponent constantly defending. So let's try it this way. How long can I stay out of Ino's way? Any move I do from here is probably just to counterattack so that I don't end up staying in the same space. The cohesion aspect of Ino's attacks disappears. It's really about, do I have my combos down? Can I keep it up? Do I anti-air correctly? Those sorts of things are the things making the decisions here. When your ability to make offense depends on your opponent's ability to do their reactive defense, when you're basically winning because they're either hitting the wrong buttons, which they could easily learn a way around, or hitting their buttons too fast or too slow, your offense will hit a wall when you've reached a player who can deal with this. And similarly, your training partners will spend time focused on doing damage or similar instead to regain themselves when they have gotten in and finally managed to hit you. In fact, you can tell when someone has gotten too used to things because they'll completely ignore or forget that you have certain tools available. None of Kai's offense works on Jam once she starts doing this. Well, none of his basic offense anyway. He has to be more creative than that. It's effectively saying, I'm going to dodge or parry everything you do. Kai, in turn, goes back to doing things that are technically defensive, making it easier for Jam to use, again, other options. The easiest thing for Omni Rabbit to do in this case is just to come forward and then block and hope that I have used a riskier option and that he can get damage off of blocking that riskier approach, that riskier counter option. See? So the match actually ends up looking kind of silly if you know the player, because it will be them dashing up in front of you and doing nothing. If you know how to handle that, for example, you get a lot more out of it. If you're not the sort that twitches because someone has done that. You can also start to read exactly how long it will take before they do something else. And more or less measure their timidity. In that case, for example, Onyaba has now learned a particular Kai option so that stops a specific thing Jam does. Timed it well too. But now that that is the case, and his mind is on that thing, I can just calculate my way around that thing. Still, it is better to learn it and not to ignore the fact that there are such options, because what you need is a repertoire of those options. You don't need to find some perfect answer. But most importantly, it is because of that that you should not try to rely on things that work really simply. Don't look for a cure-all to your problem. Look for lots of little solutions to different parts of the problem. And hope that your opponent doesn't actually have a bunch of strong solutions to them. So bear that in mind above all else. You're not looking for a way to get in. A single way to get in is never a real way to get in. Unless the game is terrible, your way to get in has a counter. And if your binariness is basically just, did I actually try to come in or did I block? Most players can learn to deal with this based on how often they see you do one or the other. So for this stream, you'll be spending a lot of time watching for that moment where the opponent runs toward or moves toward in some other way, and then just blocks with the intention of baiting something, baiting a reaction to that dash. Because once that is gone, a lot of the ways that the current offense of the team works changes. Ino has less reason to do this, but she has more reason to approach from the air in what is usually about the same way. Since she also can't actually dash on the ground, you can be sure that Ino will mostly be going into the air or doing long-range attacks. For Jam, this has a relatively easy solution. First, you build up a massive amount of capacity to do that. And then just stay like that. Your opponent can no longer do their aerial attacks from the optimal range. It's not really that your aim was to counter with that every time. It was to understand that their aerial attacks must now change because they can't use the method where they just end up putting themselves in the space to be hit by that. Which means you have other approaches you can hit to a bunch of things. Once you've trained those approaches, offense becomes relatively hard again. So while my opponent does have a lot of ways to move around the screen at the moment, I can more easily see when I need to go around certain things or not. With that additional confidence in my ability to react to and deal with their approaches with relatively higher damage, I can spend more time thinking about how to maximize damage that I get when they are out of position. I just make their life harder in general. Now, you'd obviously ask, well, why don't they just stop you from charging in the first place? Because this is also a badly positioned startup. That, for example, is actually fairly stoppable without too much effort from Jam's side. Beyond that, you can't really stop Jam from charging. You can only make sure that certain things result in charges and certain things don't. Because once Jam has distracted you enough with her own efforts to get in, it's easy to think about, okay, I'm getting damage, I'm going to keep doing that, and give her a chance to charge again. You can use this to see the mindset your opponent has at any given time a lot more easily than if you were trying to attack them, which is why generally certain characters are easier to run away from when they are footsie characters or similar, because the player eventually gets impatient and tries to find a way in, but is unable to find one that you can't calculate your way out of. This particularly helps if you have invincible moves on your side that will solve all your problems at once, if not just baited. Because you can wait until the moment in their rhythm where you are fairly sure they're going for an attack, and if they take you by surprise with whatever the attack is, or the vector is, just use the invincible move right then. That's what the charged hit was for Jam. Not so much hitting every time, but having an invincible option so that when things don't look right or I can't figure out what is going on, I can quickly execute something that solves pretty much all the problems other than the same bait of the invincible move. Attacking in this form is much more difficult against evasive characters who can launch their attacks from multiple places than it is against defensive characters. Defensive characters are often strong in that once you have made a mistake, they can punish you. Or if they particularly skillfully time one counter move, they get a big damage bonus. And they can learn over time exactly how to do that against your various things. But it takes long to do that. Evasive characters are worse because they create scrambles rather than allowing you to start pressure. With Kai, you simply block, and as the attacking player, determine whether or not Kai was in a position where Kai can move or where you can move. And once that's done, once you've built up that skill, you just keep attacking. Pressure has started. Pressure is decent in this game as well. You can get out of a lot of things. In fact, one of the things we've never covered on this stream, which is kind of surprising given how much meter that we tend to have available in these things, is the dead angle attack option. The dead angle attack is an invincible move that knocks the opponent away from you and costs 50% of your tension. The dead angle attack itself is easy to execute but harder to time than most things. However, if you are familiar with the reversals, you can probably just do exactly what you do for those. It actually only requires 2 buttons in Guilty Gear, and 3 buttons might be weird, depending on which 3 you end up hitting. But if you actually do your V reversals in Street Fighter, or I know there's another one that works like this. Not the Z change in Dragon Ball FighterZ because that only takes 1 button, but you might have set that same button in Dragon Ball FighterZ to a 2-button combination in this game. In short, when you are in that situation where you have a ton of meter, your opponent has actually managed to achieve pressure, and you don't know what to do, especially if you're in the corner, you don't actually need to burst. Burst is for getting you out of combos that are hitting you. If you're just blocking, when blocking, hit forward and 2 buttons. The timing, again, may be a little difficult, because a lot of stun in Guilty Gear is a little hard to understand and keep track of sometimes. But it's probably not that bad, especially against the sort of long attack that gets thrown into pressure, or is predictable enough that it's intended to help your opponent start pressure from far away, like various forms of charge, stun, dipper, and so on. Now, generally you do care about waiting until your opponent is actually in range to be hit by this, otherwise it will get baited just like a V reversal or a defensive Z change. But if your opponent's pressure is bothering you in the first place, that's your answer. And as soon as you feel like you have even one answer, you will also find that you feel more comfortable just sitting in that pressure. Even though, unlike many games, they have really no reason to stop it. The dead angle attack does not benefit anything. Your opponent just gets pushed off you. They don't, just like a V reversal, they don't have any reason to stop hitting the button. They don't have any reason to try to bait their way through it much. Because the mechanics of the game mean that such, once you've started it, you're probably going to hit, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. Now, Slayer has a bit more complexity in these attack strings and startups, but the overall flow doesn't really change for Jam. The main difficulty for Jam is getting out of range in the first place. Once she is, though, it's a little easier. Similarly, never underestimate the potential strength of getting your opponent off you just once. Once again, this is because of the way mindsets work in this game. And in every other game, when your opponent's mindset toward whether or not they can attack you has changed, they go on the defensive. Like that. Learning to figure out when that timing is and take advantage of it allows you to build up better options. You can build entire plans around the ebb and flow of the opponent's feeling that they can attack. Controlling momentum in this way is one of the more important things to learn in these games. It gives you time and chances to practice your own offense against players who normally are very offensive themselves. And it helps you change your perspective of when you need to be ready to defend and when you have time to take stock of your situation. Health, meter, mental state, opponent's health and meter, time left in the match, any of those things. If you know that your opponent is now waiting for another attack from you, spend that time to look at your meter. They're not going anywhere, and they're probably not hitting any buttons. In fact, if you don't block because you can afford it, them just seeing you not being in a defensive stance can often be enough. You can also stick out a long button to just fake them into thinking that. And while that long button is finishing, look at the situation. This is particularly helpful in the middle of the round. Now, while I might be sounding like I'm saying that defense in this game is relatively easy, the core component of defense in Guilty Gear is a bit more complicated than that, because while you can move up in front of the opponent and block quite quickly, a lot of characters have practically unreactable overheads if your intention was to react to it while moving forward. And if you don't want to deal with that, then you have to block by walking straight backward or jumping away, which has its own share of problems. Walking straight backward leaves you vulnerable to those. Jumping away, usually, if your opponent isn't too aggressive, loses all the benefit you had. Especially if the opponent knows how to build up certain resources or has some really long range attacks that they can use to catch you on the moment when you're about to land. In general, in this particular match between these particular players, for example, you'll see that after Slayer gets hit with the Gekurin, this knockdown, he doesn't tend to wake up with attacking. You have enough time to do a bunch of stuff. If you wanted to make him attack, charging a card at that point consistently would probably be useful. But charging the card is not a good plan. It's not the main plan. The main reason it's not a good plan is because it takes so long and it's telegraphed. Your opponent sees you do that from the beginning. You're in a rush to get it done before they wake up and counterattack you. But that's probably not what you should be aiming for. What else can you do in that space that would lead to a bonus or benefit that isn't easily telegraphed, that your opponent can't see as a benefit to you enough to make them immediately wake up with the attack, while still leaving you potentially capable of attacking yourself? A few taps or some form of wiggle will also look like the beginning of a card charge, prompting the opponent to move immediately. Depending on their disposition, they may move immediately either way. Now, as you can see, Jam never actually has to give that up. She can just attack after that button. So let's try it that way instead. Because you always do have enough in that case. Oh wait, he's back into defense mode, which means it's time to dash up and throw and things like that. Being able to read your opponent's mental state is what makes us able to be confident against other players. Until you've reached very high levels of Guilty Gear where that is something you're moving past and spending more time on playing out the matchup or the game mechanics between the two characters, This is where you should be focused as long as you feel you have your combos, or at least know what your combos are supposed to be. Once again, we don't necessarily suggest that you spend too much time specifically on mastering your combos if you understand the moment when the combo should be done and can either set it up or recognize it often enough that you can hit the first hit of it. One good example is that Jam's counter hit of her forward kick you occasionally see. The one that does follow the same Gekirin. But on the counter hit, that moves into her puffballs and does a fair amount of damage if you are ready to confirm it. Against certain opponents, I can land this probably like twice around. And were I a better Jam player, or more accurately, a more practiced Jam player, I would have spent more time learning to confirm that and get the damage from it, as well as the knockdown and the other benefits that come from there. But as we've always done in these streams, most of the team practice their neutral first until they are comfortable enough in the neutral to be confident that a particular thing is likely to happen. And from there, decide whether or not the combo should be done. Osiris Ino, for example, can often hit Kai with standing dust, sending him flying to the corner, but not necessarily pursue it. Similar things happen with Answer at particular spaces. Omni Rabbit is a bit further on, being at least willing to enter tournaments in Guilty Gear with the expectation of doing decently or getting some experience. And as a result, he has a lot more combos based on things he has managed to set into his style and see happen. But has worked on them primarily because they do come up. He does know when approximately they will come up, and will be prepared enough for them to finish them then. For example, against Jam and Ino, there are quite a few air juggle combos that need to be confirmed in very specific situations. Not every Kai has a reason to learn these combos. At least not in their early Kai career, let's say. And spending a lot of time learning every combo would just make it difficult to learn to do that one fluidly on reaction and so on. Similarly, understanding that your opponent is trying to find the mental space to think of their next attack gives you moments like that where you're relatively certain that they're not going to react to your forward movement. At the end of the day, unfortunately, building up offense takes a long time and a lot of thinking. As you get better and better, you spend less time far away from your opponent, because you need less time to take stock of the situation. Moving away from the opponent in the beginning is a good way to take stock of what their state probably is, at least while you're doing the back dash or the back walk, or whatever movement option you have for getting out of the range of any new attack. For some people, this becomes a signal for them to attack you, but most of the time they end up in front, or you have your natural auto reaction to them attacking without thinking about that, and whatever you were thinking about in terms of state of the match can immediately be dropped, because you now know the state of the match. Your opponent attempted to attack you when you hit buttons. But if you want a few moments to think about whether or not they are about to attack you again, or whether or not you should try to launch your own attack, with sort of a gradation between those things, because sometimes you'll win if you start really quickly and so on, the less time you spend moving back away from them to do this, and rather just standing quietly or having some other resource management thing going on, the more intimidating you are, and the more damage you can often get from it. Your aim basically is to dominate the space with your presence, to convince your opponent that a threat still exists that they have to think about, rather than worrying about whether or not they're going to try to present one themselves. And the more of that you do, the more important it becomes to understand your options and their options per character, This is why all of this attack and defense stuff mostly comes in after you've learned basic matchup situations and choices for the two characters in question. Guilty Gear is also not one of those games where you have a lot of universal responses to everything other characters do. You can't be sure that everyone will approach the same way on the ground. You can't be sure that everyone will approach the same way in the air. You can't be sure that certain people need to approach at all, but can't get close to you if they don't. For example, both the ninjas, Chip and Answer, can functionally teleport to the other side of you. Or at least teleport in some way. Invincible moves help, but even then there's still quite a lot of variance in whether or not you can be sure that you can deal with all opponents in the same way. So you have to understand matchups, a bit of ranges, and a bit of mental state of the sort of player you're going up against, whether or not they'll constantly try to get in, whether they're trying to measure the space to launch very precise attacks, and so on. One good example here is that, as mentioned before, Kai actually doesn't have a lot of ways around Jam's dash attempts. He relies a lot on range, but honestly Jam's crouching dust is actually quite good. Meaning that a lot of what Kai likes to do doesn't work in that space. She can cover it. Meaning that he has to stop far earlier into his approaches to avoid that particular move and basically neuter his own entire offense. Because Jam never has to be afraid of Kai getting less close than her crouching dust. And given that it is technically a whiff punish button, it's just a relatively heavy shutdown of his game plan. Fortunately, Kai again retreated, and due to my terrible misread of the situation, I went for a blitz, which is only effective against an attacker. Again, the team is not really used to the fact that I'm functionally playing a footsie character most of the time without any of her footsie tools. Because one has to learn, you can't just be getting discouraged all the time. You don't learn too much that way. Now you see the situation of Kai trying to find a way around the crouching dust, but the problem with that is he then has to try to whiff punish that, which takes away his other method of dealing with Jam. Specifically dealing with this. His option select for that does not work in that situation, forcing him to be, once again, completely defensive. The ability to shut down your opponent's offense with one button indicates that their understanding of offense is currently still limited. They have to come up with more to do it. Unfortunately, the incorrect way to deal with this is to try to deal with whatever new button is stopping you. Go for something completely new and wild, because your opponent has to react in time. They're the one that has to come up with a way to deal with you. You don't even know, for example, whether or not they can react in time if you did something else but similar. So far we've noted that the only way Ino has actually managed to try to get in is by putting the note out first. This is because, obviously, it stops Jam from using a bunch of footsie buttons. And it's definitely not a bad approach to the match, because it really is hard for Ino to just beat Jam in this space. Not due to speed, but overall ways of thinking about the matchup. Can be a little difficult from Ino's side. She's not exactly brimming with options of that kind. This is because Ino is functionally a difficult character to deal with the momentum of. You have to be willing to walk a lot, and you have to be willing to walk very confidently, knowing that at any time she can just use Chemical Love or something else to make the opponent miserable. You don't have to get into that space, because her footsie buttons are good enough that once you have walked forward and your opponent has not done anything, you literally just get to move. Most people cannot get over Ino on demand either. So she doesn't need to dash, functionally. Now, she also has some really good instant air, I believe heavy slash, for people who absolutely won't move in time. But that's actually for when you've gotten quite a bit closer. The space that other people are trying to occupy in the first place. Meaning she doesn't have to defend that space either, much like Jam doesn't have to defend that space. When you are far away, there's really no harm to putting the note down. But the amount of freedom that Ino gains from just walking can be thought of in terms of a very large radius around her that she controls while just walking. Your opponent's aim is generally to not be in that radius, or to punish you if you mess up the Chemical Love. So rather than thinking of defense as your standard strategy in that way, you can figure out the strength of most footsie characters. The fact that they're defending while walking forward. They don't have to block to defend, and they don't have to stop moving to defend. Only when they reach another footsie character with longer buttons and superior options do they have to think about walking forward is not a defense anymore. However, this requires a lot of patience, and therefore when you find yourself being impatient that day, it's often good to have a secondary whose method of doing this is evading and moving a lot. Just so you don't get caught in that feeling that just caused Rune Siren to lose, of okay, I want to attack now, but I'm going to attack in the way I always attack, specifically going into the air, aiming to come down on them, all of those things, which are generally unnecessary. It comes with a twitchiness and an impatience in wanting to do particular things. So walk your opponent all the way to the corner. Then you have tons of options. Don't let them out of the corner either. That's what those characters are good at. But if you find yourself wanting to attack before the corner has been reached, really often, you might not be in the mental state that day for playing that particular character. You have to feel a certain amount of laziness or oppressive aura to want to just be able to use your huge range to let you just walk forward. But for many characters, it really is that simple. Especially if you know your opponent's air approach in this game is not that great, Ino really can just walk people all the way to the other side of the screen. Because as soon as they move, she can just execute one move that will clip them, put them on the ground, and she gets to do it more. She can then, at her whim, do a full attack string, go into the air or whatever. Because by most standards, Ino's horizontal chemical love, 8CL as I have learned it's called from listening to commentary at Comic Breaker, just doesn't have a counter for a lot of the cast. At max range, she just gets to do that for free. At perfect range, not even Blitz will help you. It will block the attack, and that's about it. Characters like Jam who have evasive approaches can get around it entirely, and she does have to worry a little bit about that, but even that is among the hardest of possible reads. Many characters can, however, put a shield of some form in front of them, or do a quick approaching diagonal upward attack, which will get them around that specific thing. Meaning that for an Ino player who has mastered this, learning to play the corner game is more important. Learning to control a cornered opponent becomes a very large part of the game because she's so good at cornering you. Once, either by you refusing to walk backward, crouch blocking and getting hit by her standing dust as part of something else, or by you being willing to walk backward and not challenge her chemical love, therefore finding yourself in these situations. Forcing the opponent to want to challenge it is in a way to get them to attack into your footsie buttons, or at least try to get into your range in a way that you can control. So, be careful when you are playing a character with a very large radius of control. But find yourself trying to attack a lot of the time. Now if we look at Kai technically has a large radius of control also, but his is much more active than Ino and can't be done as quickly. This is because there are some gaps. Ino, with enough executional skill, covers basically a huge dome around herself. Kai has more of an L shape in the direction of the opponent with the bottom of the L. He can attack easily in front of him and decently over his head, but can't do too much if I occupy exactly this space, which is why Answer puts certain things there, for example. And because it's so relatively risky for him to do that, You find him in a lot of situations that don't suit him when that happens. Now this is not to say that it's not to say that defense is easy, because your opponent can lure you into a lot of things by switching their method of doing things entirely, which is the whole point. And you in turn must keep track of all this. But the problem still stands that if a player relies entirely on their opponent's willingness to attack and faces an opponent who is simply not willing to attack, they better be ready for a long haul of difficult things. And relatively long frustrations. Jam defenses against Kai are basically simple. The key is to fill your opponent's mind with as many different options as possible and hope that they don't have full-on reactions automatically to all of them. Unfortunately, once again, this doesn't necessarily help you. Eventually you'll reach a point where they can't react to everything you know how to do, which is in itself a victory condition. But for a really defensive player, now you've changed the situation in another way that is probably disadvantageous to you. Now you're focused on attacking, which is generally the opposite of your own strength, right? And trying to win battles of offense against offensive players can be a little tricky. Their character normally has the advantage, and if not, their mindset is probably keeping up a little faster than yours. So what is the actual aim? You want that when you attack, when you feel like attacking, you have a repertoire already ready for you to just randomly pick from and stress your opponent out. And you only even need this if your opponent doesn't get stressed as quickly as you do. An opponent whose stress level and twitchiness rises faster than yours can generally be defeated without much offensive ability at all if you can make them think that they have to have it. Demonstrating your ability to attack them even once just to reset a life lead will often affect players enough that they will continue to attack so that they can try to get far enough ahead of you. They're the one left underconfident in their ability to keep you out and win that way. Learning strong combos is another way to do this, but it relies on being able to get the neutral in the first place, and your opponent, in response to seeing themselves take huge damage from strong combos, is more likely to play the entire round with just a poke and then an escape. In other words, get the life lead and then hold on to it for a really long time. The fact that this game does not have any carryover of meter between rounds compounds this fact because they know that you didn't get to take anything from the previous round into this one. The situation has reset itself enough that they can just play the same way every time until it's successful. Baiken as a character is particularly susceptible to this because she is effectively a footsie character until she gets to a very specific range. And she has to force that range by playing footsies well enough that the opponent wants to stay there. Once she reaches that range, all of her specials become much more effective. So she's really more of a measured play character like Cell than a tricky character like Bison. She isn't really supposed to attempt to react to many things. She can stay out of pressure using her jump back attack style when the opponent is far enough away, or just even neutral jumping to generally make them miserable. Once she has done this, and has gotten to launch any attack, which is then blocked, she has advantage immediately. You can see this based on what happens when she hits her crouch punch. Many characters can chain a lot into their crouch punch, but hers is basically good for making the opponent get pushed back more on block than most. It's also slow, so you should expect as Baiken that you will hit that button a lot and it will always be blocked. Once that happens though, you can build around that. Her other crouching buttons are also good for similar reasons. You don't care whether or not they open the opponent up or do any damage because her aim is to put them somewhere. Once she has put them there, they have to make the next move, and they usually have to make it quite quickly or Baiken will make their lives miserable. The fact that she can, when feeling uncomfortable in that situation herself, just jump straight up, means that the rest of this is just playing that out over and over, more or less. Her long range standing dust makes the situation even worse for the opponent. Her slow jump makes it complicated because she also has attacks from the air. While not often used, they do change her air trajectory, and her air dash doesn't really need to be all that used. She can do tatami mat in the air if she's feeling uncomfortable with the way things are going. Or she can just do nothing because the opponent is stuck in the mat. This means that she is one of the characters who benefits most from the dead angle attack. When she finds she has put herself in a situation or gotten into the corner or something where she's not likely to be able to make any attacks at all, being able to just repel the opponent altogether without blitz helps against pressury characters. Now the problem is that it's relatively difficult for Baiken to build up the meter required for the dead angle attack, playing this way as a generality. She has to be relatively confident in her ability to stay out of attacks and do things like instant air mat to shift herself out of bad situations. Against Jam, however, this bonus increases because Jam doesn't have a lot of good buttons at the range that Baiken pushes her to. Forcing a reliance on various tricky movements and crouching does. Fortunately for Jam, a lot of Baiken's spacing against other characters doesn't work against her, leaving her feeling more likely to hit buttons in response to things that Jam ends up with punishing or countering. However, since most of these buttons for Jam are low or come downward, Baiken can just spend all that time jumping out. And if you're familiar, Jam doesn't actually have any quick attack vectors that go directly there. So, the general aim from Jam's side is to put Baiken in a space where she wants to recover constantly, but is more likely to try to counterattack or block than just jump out. You see here demonstrated quite a lot of the things that Baiken then goes, okay, my turn to hit a button. Jam is not there or has a whiff punish counter or something else. So you have to switch around your responses, which is a hard thing to do for certain people mindset-wise. It's a matter of changing her response from blocking and hitting the button to going, this flitty woman in front of me is not going to let me hit buttons, so I need to get out of her way. Come back later. Fortunately, in tournaments, you normally don't have to fight back-to-back quickly enough. You can't reset those sorts of things. And you have a decent idea in a lot of cases, at least at the high levels, of who your opponents are to begin with. So in the case of Kai, the aim is to do the normal thing. When Kai puts himself too close, poke him out and use your footsie buttons. If he doesn't put himself that close, you don't have to do anything really. for claw helps, and recognizing when he has put himself in claw range versus when he has put himself in standing dust range, is a relatively important part of this matchup. But Viking can be fairly lazy. And she knows this, you can tell by like her character design. Like most swordsmen, just is trying to measure distance and take the opponent off guard with that measured distance. Theme-wise, she's not just a character with a sword, she actually embodies the samurai style of this to some extent. I'm going to spend a large amount of the match measuring the distance between you and me, rather than trying to attack you directly on me. This in turn makes the opponent uneasy about pretty much everything they could do. Because it's just another form of mix-up. It's a mix-up that happens without being so close to each other. Once Viking has that down, it's easier to understand how to use her air attacks to help her approach, or rather to help her not actually approach, similar to how Jam does it. Viking's aim with her aerial attacks is not necessarily to make the opponent get hit or get in close enough to do attacks, but rather to stop them from moving so she can land near them in her own preferred space again. If the only thing you ever achieve by a jump in or air dash attack with Viking is to make your opponent block, then you've achieved your goal for the most part. She cares about opponents who go over or challenge her in the air. If your opponent stayed on the ground and blocked, mission accomplished. In fact, she also doesn't even have particularly good combos when she does land her jumps. So why care about it? This does require quite a lot of reactive ability in terms of poking people to death with weird timers. And at first you can see that it is more likely that the Viking player will jump back due to being underconfident about being able to hold the opponent or react in time. So they create space in order to do this. But it's really not that necessary. You're possibly hurting yourself in the long term by being so twitchy about repositioning out of danger. Because what will eventually happen is that you will find someone who punishes that really hard, but that will mean that you are cut down to 3 or 4 interactions there with that. And if you get it 3 times wrong in a row, not only will it kill you, it will leave you with very little information or feeling to go into the next match with. In other words, one can't learn to not do it if your opponent manages to kill you too fast for doing it. This is partially why top-level Viking players talk about how important it is to be able to do the instant air tatami mat input. Because it brings together all of these effects at once. You can simply go straight from defense to aerial form defense that will give you advantage. Rather than having to go all the way in the air, give them time to think about it, and so on, you just instantly recover out and up, solving all of your problems at once. This also makes it extremely necessary to be effective against jam if you don't have the standard responses down. But as you can see, that spacing that has just been created by just that block string is not advantageous to jam. If anything, you'd have to say it's advantageous to Viking. However, the advantage at that point required is relatively execution heavy. Meaning that until you've mastered that, at least to some extent, this match is fairly heavy on the suffering. At least if the jam player is patient enough. Once again, you see that mat. Why is spiking a lot of time? Because it's effectively a very slow-moving projectile. Once that space has been created and the confidence to utilize it has become part of the player's mindset, playing Viking becomes a lot easier as a whole. It's very important, therefore, to measure the ranges of your moves, push back from block strings, and so on. If you're playing a 2D fighter, this is one of your most important skills. 3D fighters also require this skill, but they take a different approach to it, and it might not be something that you describe in the same way, because if you try to do exactly the same thing, it might be a little confusing. Therefore, the core of this play is watching where you are at the end of either your or your opponent's block string, and avoiding scrambles until you're more used to this. There are opponents who will try to keep you out, but at Bike is actually fairly hard to keep out for long periods. She has a lot of good tools for forcing situations, not forcing damage, but she can force the situation and from that situation maybe get the damage. Once you've done enough of that, as you can see, you build up enough meter for the dead angle attack to become a real option again. And therefore don't really have to worry so much about pressure situations either. It comes down to, have I been whiff punished enough times to make myself uncomfortable? But at the end of the day, this is really hard to do at high levels without the mat, which is why you constantly hear about it. It is not specifically, this is the best combo ever. In fact, it's relatively difficult to combo with the air mat, and most of the time you wouldn't even want to. There are certain matchups where it's the go-to approach, but especially at this level, comboing into instant mat is not the point of being able to do that input. It is to get into the air and activate the mat with the least possible time for your opponent to hit you before you can get it out. And if you watch carefully, you can see a lot of those spaces here where the mat would solve the problem. The difference in Vikin's both offensive potential and overall play, granted by your ability to do that at crucial moments, is quite high. But you shouldn't make yourself, when you hear people talking about your need to be able to do the mat like that, they're not saying it because unless you can do the instant one, it's useless. What they're trying to express is that when you can't do the instant one, you're at higher risk than if you can. But any practitioner of Kendo can tell you that this is mostly just standard footsies. And here we see more situations where Viking would just be better off if she was off the ground immediately at the end of a block string, rather than having to wait for the next hit and block that too. The difficulty simply being that without the mat block is your main option, and being off the ground immediately becomes riskier because you don't have anything that will take up the space you need. The mat makes your opponent think about more situations, and you therefore get more chances to reset yourself. In desperate situations, you can somewhat use her Roman cancels for the same purpose, because they stop your upward momentum and allow you to do other attacks, or to just give yourself time to do the mat itself after all that. However, for various other reasons in the matchup, using your meter like that is literally a crutch for when you are panicked and don't feel you can make the mat work. For Jam to have an advantage in this matchup, she has to be either daring about when she parries, knowing the opponent's movement timing, or have something ready to counter their attack spacing. For example, knowing when each attack is coming is more important than actually landing your own stuff. Because getting any one of them gives you time to build up enough power through something else to defeat the opponent. But back to Kai. So far we know 3 ways that Jam can actually keep Kai out. But she has like 10. The problem is mostly that Kai can do increasingly riskier things to invalidate her 10, making this more of a battle of outputs. And Kai actually tends to win that battle. Therefore, as the Jam player, your job should be to work out as much as possible how and where you can use the timing for your knockdowns that come from him trying to get in, to get enough cards and charge to do damage. Secondarily, how you can avoid getting caught in the idea that you must attack when it's your opponent's turn. Because Kai does not have to be as precise with his buttons. He can basically mash either slash or heavy slash, and one of the moves that comes out will be in approximately the same direction and you'll win. Depending on the situation, of course. But for the most part, against close range characters, he doesn't care. Therefore, you must have all of your abilities on point at the moment you choose to do them. The more resources you have available for Jam to do damage, the better your situation turns out over time. And once you have the life lead, Kai's job is much harder. Not only does he do poor damage off of those confirms, he's also relatively susceptible to that once he starts attacking. Most Kai players don't have a strong instinctive offense. and can only deal very small bits of damage over time. And as mentioned before, once you get them into that mindset that they must attack, it becomes easier to catch them with certain things, but you have to recognize that their mindset has changed. For example, what is my opponent's mindset right now? I read it as defensive. They're hitting buttons and they're trying to fake out the idea that they're actually trying to attack me, but they're not. That was a switch to offense, which means I get to win. Well, apparently not today. Once you learn to read this, you will just generally dismantle your opponent. Jam also has the capacity, therefore, to change the ranges that she has for things to make Baiken more miserable. Once you start playing the spacing game against Jam, it becomes in her best interest to charge Gekurin instead of anything else. You can't be certain that the dragon will help, and even if it will, it'll probably help uncharged just as much. But being able to change the range at which that works, and therefore where Baiken can safely stand, is a much bigger deal in the matchup. Because that button is better at shutting down Baiken's footsies and her defense than the others, while that attack. Since Jam has few other options for getting through Baiken's normal range, without risking being countered fairly hard, it's a fairly easy decision. player is another one of those characters like Kai who really can't do a lot about Baiken's jump out. He has to corner her first. Baiken's problem being that unless she can hold Slayer at a particular range, jumping out does not help because his mobility becomes his next response to the situation. Since his dash is invincible, he does not have to care as much about whether or not she chose to try to get out of the way or just hit another button. He can just dash either way. Once he has done this, especially with certain of his moves being invincible on approach also, he doesn't have to avoid anything. At least not through spacing himself. The important thing is that Baiken will then still hit him if she can execute the mat. Without it, it becomes a very high-speed interaction set between them. That may be difficult to keep up under those situations. Surprisingly, Johnny vs. Baiken doesn't change it. Despite Johnny's immaculate range, his attacks are just slow enough that if Baiken defends correctly in the same way as she was before, she really is not in any danger. Since Johnny's attacks are slow enough that she will recover from her dash or manage to land the mat in a spacing where he can do little about it. You have to be quite ready for this though, because Johnny can block the mat and proceed, whereas other characters, once they block the mat, are generally out of range of being able to hurt Baiken. But as you can see, her space, the space she ends up getting to occupy due to that positioning, is relatively easy for her to maintain, and Johnny's ability to attack her in that space relies on her making a mistake. He's also relatively susceptible to her standing dust once he tries to get in. Whereas the string you see him using now is not really one that Baiken can't get out of. The start of that move at the end of the string is long enough for her to do certain things. Now, back again to the Baiken-Kai interaction. We're already seeing it start to emerge fairly quickly. Kai is often hit by Baiken's standing dust for many reasons. In fact, Kai is hit by a lot of people's standing dust. But the important thing about that is that Kai is also a character that suffers a lot of pain by the mix-ups that follow a standing dust combo, as he has less evasive options. Obviously, we're going to see less effectiveness until the jumping air mat and instant air mat become standard options. But if you're aware enough of the game, you can still watch for when it would have made a difference. And this is important for when you're playing against friends who don't have a combo down yet, because you can simply adjust your own approaches based on knowing you would have been hit if they could do a particular move. It is that sort of thinking that lets us say, I should not have won that. Because you know your opponent dropped something, and if it was not necessarily that they dropped a combo, they dropped a move that affects the matchup. So you can see here, Viken's options very, very quickly expand once you can do this move. But again, do not hold yourself back from playing this character because you can't do it every time, or because you can't do it at the minimum height. This is more of advice for people who play people who could react to and deal with you going into the air quickly enough that if you couldn't do the instant mat, you would get hit all the time. Similar to that. But this is one, no reason to give up, and two, no reason to play an inferior style of Viken. If you like this character and you like her ability to just measure space and stay out of the way, then absolutely go for the mat regardless of whether or not you can consistently do it. The consistency will come. And in the meantime, you'll be able to watch the match and see when things could have gone better if you were able to, and possibly, depending on your emotions, feel either good about it or sad that it never works.
Get up to burn! Stand with the
It helps that Viken's damage is really high compared to most characters as well. So adding mobility and options to her in the form of that means it's really easy to deal with situations like this. And there you see the other part of her ability to do this. Since Viken has the ability when the opponent is likely to make a certain type of attack to use her jump forward down strike as yet another way out of it. She doesn't even always need the mat. If you're confident that your opponent will not block or will be trying something that will cause them to go under and through your mat, you have options. Specifically, you have one option, but it's a really strong option. When you find yourself in these situations, especially at the end of a block string, Johnny being a very good example of this, think about watch the opponent's hitbox and think to yourself, does that actually cover all the space it appears to cover? Do I get to hit like a low profile move? Do I get to hit a counter because it's too slow? Do I get to jump out because even though it looks high, it isn't actually high? This is how you discover ways out of pressure that appears real, because players will usually do them anyway, especially if the move spaces them in such a way that leaves them without a serious concern. Here, for example, Johnny has the option of attacking in multiple directions. If you watch carefully enough, you'll get to see it. At the end of that block string, Johnny does different slashes in different directions. But if one slash covered all the directions, wouldn't that be weird? Why would he have 3 different directional slashes? Your assumption from there should be, wait, those can't all cover the same space. So therefore, the reason he must have all these options should also imply that I too have a lot of options. I just don't know what they are yet. So pick one and then watch Johnny. We see there, for example, that simply blocking Johnny's mid version of that puts Spike in at a decent place, pushes himself back quite a lot, and resolves her problem. And looks like the lag's clearing up. Maybe. Johnny's inability to dash and keep dashing is a fairly heavy limit on him for keeping up pressure. And needs to be kept in mind. Top tier never means unbeatable. You can see here the very heavy amount of defense that the mat allows in this matchup because of his inability to run and his slower attacks. He doesn't get a lot of momentum attacks off it, and can be somewhat shut down if you know exactly how to space this, because he also cannot afford to just immediately start using anti-airs either. And looks like we're out of the lag. Yes. Last time we saw this matchup, we had a basic discussion about spacing and when Kai can interrupt Johnny's stuff without being cut himself. The main problem is that if Kai tends to use his conventional push-out buttons, it puts Johnny at massive advantage, but also leaves Kai feeling as if he can't approach. One might feel as if Kai doesn't have a lot of unconventional approaches in the first place, but this isn't strictly true, because again, remember, Johnny can't cover space fast enough on his own to get through a lot of Kai's better zoning tools. To avoid Kai's zoning, Johnny must give Kai the space advantage. He must give him the positional advantage. And once Kai has that, Kai can jump, Kai can use other attack vectors, and generally stress Johnny out. It's not necessarily enough to win, but you can see there, just having to dash in that particular way, that stuttery movement, means that the fluidity of being able to stop at a very specific point that you have measured is not something Johnny naturally has. Kai knows after 2 dashes, Johnny will be approximately here, and he doesn't have the option to just not do the 2 dashes. But understanding where exactly your zoning should go in order to make Johnny nervous like this is something you have to build up over time. Because if you make a mistake and Johnny does get into your space, this happens. Fortunately for Kai, he has invincible moves to deal with this. Because rather than playing the footsie game with Johnny's long normals and then having no chance of landing either Greed Sever or Vapor Thrust, this situation is the opposite of that. Kai's zoning forces Johnny to move into a space where Kai can use those moves. Even his combos will end up starting and being much closer. And Kai can just defend himself in the standard way that he's used to doing from other characters. This is also true because, again, Johnny must dash. He can't stop his forward movement early and block like some characters, or fake the dash and move forwards quickly and stop. He will get hit because he's vulnerable, unlike nearly everyone else.
Get up to rock! Get up to burn! Step into the fight! Feel your desire!
One of Slayer's main reasons for suffering in this matchup is actually that Slayer doesn't have a lot of really fast responses to Kai's pressure, which is not something that you hear a lot of the time. Kai's pressure is relatively linear, but the fact that a lot of it moves him either low profile or into the air means that a lot of Slayer's head-on attacks don't quite work. Unlike a sword where you are extending your entire hurt box early, Slayer has a bit of a wind-up to his stuff. Meaning that Kai can do that sort of thing a lot if Slayer decides, I'm just mashing buttons to save myself. Similarly, Kai's ability to space himself exactly where he wants to be leaves Slayer without a lot of options for directly challenging, because you can't be absolutely sure whether or not this is a trap. Is Kai just going to do Greed Sever and win by virtue of being too far out for you to hit him, but if he does Greed Sever, he still clips you anyway? At that range, especially in the corner, it's difficult to avoid sliding.
Get on to rock, get up to burn. Step with the fire. Be your desire.
As you can see here, most of this is about Viking's failure of certain execution to keep Slayer from being able to use certain approaches. She can't confirm into her big damage, meaning that slowly he wears her down without actually doing much of anything. But again, you still shouldn't give up on the execution of it. You still shouldn't try to play Baiken without it if your style is like this. If you're the hard reads type player, it works out. Faust is another character where the instant air mat, or at least air mat at all, is a relatively big deal. Because Lycan has very few ways to approach Faust without being able to do it on her jumps. He can spend most of his time blocking and not worry too much about anything. Once an item is out, he doesn't care. She either has to be able to take up a certain space on screen, which has a lot to do with whether or not an item is there. If not, she absolutely can use her claw. But if there is an item there, she's basically reduced to, can I mat through this? And as he is like Jam and not so easy to stop from doing certain things, she has to try to build up enough meter before this happens to use the dead angle attack and actually get out of Faust's pressure. When you're fairly confident that your opponent will no longer challenge the mat, then that opens up your potential to not use it, and simply use a jumping attack, of which Lycan has several. If you've trained your opponent not to challenge her jumps, your options open up. Measuring your opponent's position from the air quickly enough to determine whether or not you should do a particular attack is one of the key aspects of this game for most non-zoning characters. These games are generally called air dashers, partially for that reason. Note that not all anime games are air dashers in the straight sense, and not all should be considered the same way, even if they contain the same sort of air dashing. Marvel games, for example, are quite air dashy a lot of the time, whereas Under Night is, you can do things like it, but you're not really doing the same thing most of the time. A few characters happen. The reason it's brought up is because the neutral of the game changes based on your ability to move through the air a certain distance. And by how many options you have for doing air movement once you've tried.
Get on to rock! Get up to burn! Stand with the fight! Duel! One! Desire!
Similarly, understanding how and when to extend your hitbox or not, when you do go into the air, changes a lot of the flow of the game for Baiken. She can sometimes just neutral jump and hit nothing, or hit a very short button that will stop the opponent from coming into the air after her, but not actually do much else. This allows her to play a keep-out game without necessarily devoting herself to any particular method of doing so. The strength to change your opponent's frame of mind with your moves allows you to push forward in a lot of ways that aren't immediately obvious. There are definitely a few things that you would think I simply can't get away with, that become standard parts of your play once you've convinced your opponent that you're going to do something else.
Get up to rock, get up to burn. Step in the fire. Duel, one,
昔の君は理想論者だった。王たる重責を知った今、どんな答えを導くのか興味が尽きないよ。
お頼み申す。お頼み申す。卒じながら冥府はいず。外道が笑えば民がなる。所領に拉致なき。
So once again, the fray between the sword users.
己は美道の三品侍。指導死に花無用の所存。
Kai has more counters to the mat than most characters. Simply sticking out buttons under biting directly isn't usually enough. However, Kai does not have the similar counters to her general jumping attacks. he must anti-air those properly, in which case he normally forfeits his ability to stop the match. Baiken therefore can, as mentioned, use her aerial mobility and changes in flow to measure distances where she wants to be versus Kai and get to that spot. It is absolutely not about hitting Kai. Once the Kai player has gotten used to the fact that Baiken can just move to where she wants and he can do nothing about it, they're more likely to move around themselves, opening themselves up to mat stuff again. This expands the risk space of the game quite a lot. And as Baiken can often, once again, hit Kai with standing dust, especially when she manages to do a non-Mac style jumping, Kai can't really afford to throw out a lot of random buttons. He also can't afford to try to defend by staying still. For example, we see our Baiken mostly trying to hit low on Kai for some reason, even though it's relatively unnecessary. The worst that will happen if her standing dust is blocked is usually nothing whatsoever. But we were able to look at that match and see at least 5 interactions where standing dust would have broken Kai's defense or changed the situation to Baiken's favor by changing the spacing so she didn't have to worry about wiggling around and trying to get away from him. Now, as noted, it's actually fairly hard for Faust to get real pressure. If you block Faust for long enough, especially in the corner, he will mostly push himself out. There are definitely ways to get around this, but for the most part, just block. Every time you fail to block on pickup against Faust, you have robbed yourself of a chance to control the match. There's a good example of Faust's ability to get over you, but the problems that come up from Faust opening you up that way are so small compared to this that you might as well take it. Especially if the Faust player needs to do it over and over, because that particular thing is counterable. And if you're watching closely enough, you can probably just be blocked further on reaction, though blocking is not really what you want to do.
民がなり諸行に拉致なき沙汰あれば魔道の始末を己は美老の三品侍指導死に花無用の所蔵
The positional reset offered by the standing Dust versus Kai is helpful to Baiken in this matchup for many reasons. As a general rule, Kai's ability to get in on Baiken without having to deal with her counters is much less than most characters. He can throw out some zoning tools, but it's not necessarily the best option. Especially since, if he really tries to chase his fireballs, for example, Baiken can actually low profile them all. The main reason is, once Kai does attempt an attack, Baiken has a few universal mechanic style methods of dealing with that. But, more importantly, it allows her to build up enough meter to do dead angle, super, and anything else she may need to reset the situation again immediately. As you see demonstrated there, once Kai has come to the conclusion that Baiken is going to use the mat, the buttons he uses to prevent that mat from making contact with him while still trying to attack her are really vulnerable to all of her other jumping attacks. Once Faust has pushed himself out, it's relatively easy for Baiken to escape anything else because of her strong tendency to counter him correctly. Jumping to stay out of his buttons obviously will not work as effectively as with other characters given that they're so long. But she can more or less go straight into counter stuff as soon as she sees certain things happen. It just takes a little bravery to actually do your counter when you see a block happen. Once Faust is at a certain range, his options for which button to hit next are limited, obviously. And once his options for the next button to hit have become limited enough, you are either going to counter them or not. You can even respond to items with just counters, approaches, that thing that Viking does to approach. In general, all it takes is you trusting that it will actually work. If it doesn't work, so what? You will have learned how it works in general. But trying to defend yourself and stay out of Faust's bad spaces will lead to this. The other thing it will allow, obviously, is that if you can get Faust to hesitate in order to beat your counter, you can jump. If you find yourself having trouble executing moves out of block stun, this is the sort of thing that, again, you take into training mode. It's fairly easy to set up. Even in this game with only one recording, a chain or a string or something that you can get the CPU to repeat. And most of those combos can be just looked up. There are obviously some players out there who use some extremely creative combos. But overall, for the most part, eventually people move toward one of 2 to 3 optimal ones for their style, and they most likely have put that information somewhere online for you to reference. So, if you want to try to recognize a complex combo for a character, one of the main things you can do is check out the character's challenges in the training mode by selecting that character and going through a demonstration of their combos. When you see the combo that you get hit by, then you know which one it is, and the game will outright give you instructions on how to do it. You can then input it yourself and resolve your problems from there. If you have a general issue with doing moves out of block stun, the CPU can help, but also any reasonably complex combo, or just run through a couple of them. You can learn more about other characters as well as practicing your own execution with unfamiliar things, so that you can feel more comfortable if you find yourself needing to do unfamiliar things with your own character. So just rotate through various things and practice your lock stun execution, your reversal execution that way instead. Now do note, of course, that you may sometimes need to do this with the input lag of the game set to particular levels. But fortunately for most of us, this game is not so strict in terms of doing a move out of block stun that this comes up often. There's enough of a buffer that if you learn to do it as early as you could out of said block stun, the lag will handle the rest for you and autocorrect at the end. Especially since this particular game uses slowdown netcode, which means it will introduce a few more frames to your opponent's side, or rather to the startup of their move, so that yours still does what it's supposed to. So in this case, it may be necessary to practice doing moves out of Faust block stun specifically if it's unfamiliar enough to be difficult. But you can see that moment where Faust has nothing further to do and must throw an item or stick out a long button. Viking can just attack them. She doesn't necessarily reach him, but she does get options. She does not have to stand there and wait for the item to do its thing, for one. And just being able to change that aspect of this is enough to keep her in the match and not stuck in the corner against Faust pressure. Depending on Faust's item, there's also very little threat to Viking as she doesn't really get hurt by them while doing that move. A lot of them that do make contact with her despite her doing that really don't give Faust enough advantage that Viking needs to care. She can still just do it anyway. At this point we see we've reached the point where Faust is able to continue pressure by being more creative, but this means that the long-term pressure that Viking was facing before, which is inescapable, is no longer happening. Once you're able to recognize that the opponent's pressure has changed, a lot more of your options open back up again. That strong approach tool that Viking continues to use stands up against a lot of this game's characters, because you have to be ready for not only her using it, but specifically what she follows it up with. In other words, you can't really tell Viking, I'm staying away from you, by trying to hit her in the mid-screen before she can even try to get close. She can always try to get close. Which reaction you use is obviously up to you, and you can absolutely beat a lot of the stuff she does. But if your concept of how to do this is staying at max range for pokes and reacting to any movement, which is relatively easier than complex stuff, she will tend to pick you apart. This combines with her ability to stay in the air and vary her air approaches, so that you can't even say, okay, I'm just gonna wait until this happens. These situations consistently worsen for you if you're counting on the Viking player running into your buttons and getting stopped, because she, as this sort of character, is generally not too susceptible to that. Furthermore, her large amounts of meter gain from continually trying. Every time you fail a defense against her, she gains even more meter. She can spend most of the round with full meter, just as Jam can. What the player chooses to do with that meter varies, but she definitely has a lot of options with it. And you, as the poke out approach person, end up building up a lot less of your own, relatively speaking. This allows her to use Blitz, Roman cancels, and obviously her fairly long-range supers to stress you out when you finally think you've got things under control. Being able to reposition herself like that is similarly a large benefit. This ability to make you hesitate to hit buttons when she is approaching also means she gets to dash in a few more situations than most characters can safely do. And once again, full meter, easily. Did we mention that she confirms into super really easily? But now we go into our final match of the night. But we'll be here every week. Except maybe when we're back from tournaments. And the next whole team tournament is Shine in August, so you can count on it for quite a while. Tomorrow, we'll have more sandbag casual Street Fighter V content, or something very similar at least. And on Thursday, Kame House beginner lobbies for Dragon Ball Fighters. Again, remember this is US East Coast. We are perfectly fine with lag, but you may not be, so don't overdo it. Just enjoy the stream if you unfortunately are not able to count on having good connection to the US East Coast / Midwest area. On Friday, we're likely to have actually no stream for once, for various logistical reasons. Or just some random tech-ins. And I do mean completely random tech-ins. And of course, next Monday, back around to the Mishmash Lounge, which is our Street Fighter Lounge content. Not technically beginners. And also definitely not Loser Stays On. Bringing us right back around to our Tuesday train. And hopefully, more discussions of Guilty Gear knowledge. the hardest of reads to Roman cancel your own super for the win. And with that, Faust conveys our general feeling. And some wisdom for the ages. That said, this has been Rillian for 2_MK. Good night, everyone.